Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our awesome transformative leadership panel, Global Tariffs, What's Next for the Supply Chain Industry. I'm Michelle Dilly, CEO of Awesome. And for those of you who may be joining us for the first time today, Awesome stands for Achieving Women's Excellence in Supply Chain Operations, Management, and Education. And we are the preeminent women's professional group for supply chain industry, with more than 1,500 senior women leaders that make up the organization. Our goal at Awesome is to advance and transform the future of supply chain leadership. And one of the ways that we do this is by hosting virtual events like today's panel, where we bring senior leader women together in supply chain that can be recognized and share their insights on hot topics that are hitting us within our jobs day in and day out. Our conversation today, we're going to dive into a topic that really is top of mind of everybody globally, and that is global tariffs. For supply chain leaders, these new tariffs present unique and significant challenges. Much of the burden is falling on our shoulders, and it's up to us to make these large-scale strategic decisions, which will determine the fate of many of our organizations. So, how do we know what the right course is when information is so fluid and changes are so costly? To explore this incredible challenge, we've gathered a group of remarkably talented supply chain experts who are going to share their insights on how global tariffs are impacting the supply chain, and most importantly, what we can do about it. So joining us today, we have Melinda Caltabione, who is the Specialist Leader in Supply Chain Operations with Deloitte. Welcome, Melinda.
Thank you.
We have Anjali Mather, who is a partner with E&Y. Hi there. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for
having me. And
lastly,
we have Sarah Matthews, who's Managing Director with Accenture. So welcome, ladies, and thank you for joining us today. I cannot wait for everyone to hear all of the amazing insights that you each are bringing to the table. Before we get started, though, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So as the panelists are talking, we want to encourage all of you to utilize the chat function to reach out and to connect with one another. You can see who's actually here in the conversation with us. And if you would like to submit questions for the panelists, which we'll do questions in the later part of the webinar, then you can submit those questions through the Q&A function. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I thought what we would do is kind of just lay some ground or some foundation about, where we're starting with today. We know that the trade war, we've been anticipating this coming for several months now, but it's officially begun. So as supply chain experts and consultants, what are you seeing that's happening in your respective industries right now? And I'd love to hear from each of you what your initial reactions are to this unprecedented rollout of these historical actions. So Melinda, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. I think unprecedented is a good way to start us off. I'd say there's also some other. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Uncertainty, a little bit of instability, and pretty much some unsustainable actions, I think, that are happening for supply chain leaders right now. So I work with healthcare supply chain leaders, and I think the change in how things are being rolled out and how quickly they are changing is just led to a lot of just questioning where will things land, and how do we prepare? How do we plan? What should we be thinking about? What do we budget? So a lot of the questions that are really impacting every industry is like what to do right now. And I know we've heard this, is this sort of like COVID 2.0? And those first, I think you mentioned like those first few weeks of COVID, like how to respond, how to react, and also taking into account, how did they react previously in uncertain times, and making sure that any plans that are put in place are thoughtful. But I would say just that uncertainty, we've been leading a lot with saying there's a lot of uncertainty right now. So what can we do to, manage what we can?
Great. Thank you. And Sarah, how about you?
Thank you. I work in the utilities industry. And in the utilities industry, we are facing a lot of similar challenges as all the other industries. The biggest impact for us is that aluminum, steel, and rare earth minerals are crucial for the continued maintenance and safety of the grid. And even prior to the impact of the tariffs, we already were ramping up pretty strongly to build data centers and to understand to build a grid that's going to support the electric vehicle industry. And so as this has hit, all of my clients are asking, well, what do we do? Because 40 to 50% of our materials for capital projects, for the grid, for the, EVs and the data centers, everything we need has now increased by a minimum of 25%. And so that's the biggest challenge that is really happening for us, right? Is how are we going to manage the increase in cost? Because for those of you who aren't familiar with utilities, their revenue is set by the Public Utilities Commission of each state. So they can't increase their rates. They don't have any more money to get, right? It's whatever was approved is what they have to then budget. They can't increase their revenue in order to pay for projects, right? So instead they have to adapt what projects they're going to do. And so that's the biggest challenge, right? Is what do we build? We can't reduce maintenance, we can't reduce safety. So what do we build next? That's the biggest challenge they're facing with the budget that they have.
That's really interesting. I did not know that about the budget, so thank you for sharing
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
And Angela, you are coming at us from the retail sector, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if I think about some of the data, right? So if you think about the different areas in retail and consumer products, there's a lot of different industries, but let's talk about maybe like the clothing industry, for example. Given the tariffs that have been put in place, they're estimating in the future about a 33% increase in the overall cost for clothing, which is very interesting in terms of how that will impact the sales. But the other data point that I think is also interesting is the top 10% earners in the US are doing about 50% of the spending right now in the US. So that makes you think about, okay, well, the luxury goods that are being sold will continue to be spent on. Those earners are probably going to continue to spend money on whatever products that they need. It's really about the discretionary spending of the other 50%, other 80% of the industry, right? Of like, how are they going to proceed with having enough money to spend on brand loyalty, for example, or shifting to different brands because they can't afford to keep that brand loyalty. So that's an area that I think is huge in terms of uncertainty in our industry. And so that's one area that I think is very interesting on what's happening. And then the other thing I think is very interesting is that, companies, I think across the board, we've always said how important data is, but it's extremely important in any of our industries right now because they are needing the data to truly understand the impact these tariffs are going to make on their industry. And, like part of them thinking about the future is based on that data. And so I know Sarah touched on that data too, but I think it's interesting that companies are really having to double down on looking at, how are these tariffs going to impact us in terms of cost? Where are we, bringing in product from different places? So they have to understand their network very detailed and where they're sourcing all that information and the products. So that's something that I know across the industry they're having to take a look at. And I just find it fascinating.
Oh, I agree with you. I mean, data is always so important, but it's never
Mhm.
crucial than today. And it will be interesting to see how things shake out with brand loyalty and see who
Yes.
actually will come out winners or on top of this after all of this is going on. So let's talk a little bit more about information. It just seems like it's just so fluid. I mean, you turn on the news and you hear something in the morning and it is totally different 6 hours later. So, where are you getting your information from? Where are you finding the most relevant information? And then how are you having time to use that to plan, to react, to anticipate, and to help organizations move forward?
I'm
Sarah,
happy to jump in. Thanks, Michelle. You're absolutely right. The information is changing constantly. So with our clients, we've been trying to keep up and keep them up on the latest changes. And then, again, understanding when that change, what that impact will be. But I mean, you really do have to keep on top of multiple sources. Obviously, the news is a big one, and you can have that 24/7 because things are rolling out in maybe non-traditional ways that they had in the past. So it could be in a more social setting where comments are made. So just trying to understand, where the impacts might be and what might change, and how everyone responds to that. So we definitely keep on top of news feeds and alerts, working in with healthcare clients, also looking at potential recalls or shortages. A lot of it is about supply chain shortages, which is, again, coming out of COVID. I don't think we ever got back to potentially what was normal or before COVID. So really trying to keep on the pulse of, any potential impact to the supply chain based on a particular supplier who might have heavy exposure to a heavily tariffed country that might then, impact the rest of the supply chain. So it's minute by minute, and just trying to keep up on the latest, and then keeping our clients updated as well. So any and all sources of information are certainly taken into consideration.
It seems like there's no single one source of truth either. So you have to look to different outlets to gather and figure out what makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like podcasts. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. There are some that are really specific to the energy industry. If you ever want to like get really nerdy with me, there's a lot of really good ones. I also really, Accenture has a really good macro foresight team. They provide us updates it feels like every day. And so I know that also that at Melinda and Anjali's companies, that's also very true, right? We work for companies that have exceptional economists that are sharing on the daily information with us that we can then share with our clients. And then in the market right now, there are a lot of really cool tools that are being built or already existed that are creating scenario planning using Gen AI, and they're scraping data and applying it to digital twins and building out networks for scenario planning. And so I think that when we think about information and for like our clients, the best way to do that is to be able to build that kind of tool that's going to scrape for you and apply and disseminate information, because individuals, we have a finite amount of time, and we're all in supply chain, we're always very busy, right? So to apply the next latest thing and then know whether or not that next latest thing is going to happen tomorrow or not is really difficult. Because planning, right? We all know, everybody here has done forecasting in their career, so we all know how complicated that is. And then I follow like a lot of the big banks and the analysts, and I read the Financial Times and pretty much all the analysts. Like it's like my morning podcasts, walk podcasts, and like the news.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Sarah mentioned that we have a wealth of knowledge within our organizations. I think each one of us have the ability to tap into our group organizations. I think one that was not mentioned that I've gotten a lot of really rich information from is our tax organization. So our global tax organization has been doing a really good job of understanding all the policies and legalese, I would say, that comes out from these policies, and disseminating it into realistic, things that we can consume and understand as non-tax people, and understand the impacts that these are having on our clients, and how we may be having conversations with our clients and topics that we should be bringing up with them. So I think that's a new area for me, is really getting into the tax world and understanding how these tariffs are impacting our clients. And then also just talking to clients. I think a lot of what I've learned about how our industry is being impacted is through talking to clients and understanding how they're navigating this and what they're thinking about. And then I think another area that both touched on is economists and listening to them. We had the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce actually has an economist that works for them, and he came in and spoke to us at the EY Atlanta office recently, and it was just so enriching to understand, how these tariffs are impacting clients, and talking through the different industries and how it's impacting inflation. It's an area that I really haven't spent a lot of time in my past, but I've really been diving into it. And if you can find someone who can really translate it into something you understand, it's so valuable.
Angela, you bring up a really good point, because we think about the tariffs, but it's a complicated situation because it's the tariffs
Mhm.
element, but there's all these other elements like taxes and
Yep.
subsidies and other things that really all come into play to kind of paint the true picture of what the cost structure now looks like. So those are
Mhm.
great points. Thank you for bringing that up.
Mhm.
So I want to talk a little bit now about the concept of reshoring jobs. So, we with COVID, everything was, oh, we need to bring it back closer. We need to near shore. And now we're talking about, creating more jobs in the United States. And there's such a big push for that. So when we think about reshoring jobs, there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of discussion about bringing manufacturing back to the US, but
Mhm.
not so much about the reality of what does it cost? How much time does it take to do that? And then from a training and from an upskilling perspective, when you think about the workforce that will be doing this, I'd love to hear all of your thoughts around this. Do American workers have the skill sets or even the desire to do what's required to help these manufacturing facilities become successful, bringing them back to the US and manufacturing back in the US? Or do you feel like those jobs will be automated if they return back to our shores?
So I have several opinions on this. My first is that I strongly believe Americans can do anything,
Mhm.
right? I do. I think anyone, anywhere can be trained to do anything. I genuinely think that we are a nation of incredibly hardworking, talented, intelligent people. So yes, can people do it? Totally. 100%. But the question isn't whether or not they can, or even if they will. I think the question is, can companies afford it? Right? And how many jobs will it actually bring? Right? So for example, if we built a plant in the 70s or 80s, that plant would have had 1,000, 2,000 workers. If you build a plant today, you maybe have 10% of that.
Mhm.
And there's a huge push in digital manufacturing in the past 10 years, 5 years, even closer in, where we're building lights out manufacturing, right? We're building lights out distribution and warehousing. So those plants and those warehouses have very few, if any, people. Many times they're run by corporate, right? It's all automated. So we have to be thinking about when we bring jobs back, yes, they exist, but they exist at a smaller amount. And so I think it's more about what are the additional benefits potentially of reshoring, right? And so some of those, to me, some of those are when you build resilience into your supply chain, you have shorter lead times, you have faster production cycles, you have increased flexibility, you have reduced risks, right? Because your supply chain is closer to shore, right? I also think that there's, I'm really big into the energy transition. So for me, the idea of reduced carbon emissions is huge, right? I think that's a really big benefit that will come out. There's also a lot of increased tax revenues for local and federal governments when you onshore, even if it's a small amount of individuals or humans in the plant, you're still paying taxes to run those facilities in those towns, right? So I do think that there's benefit, and I do think Americans can really do anything. I just think it's difficult, right? Because wages are 3 to 5 times at minimum more expensive here. And you have to create a value proposition for a company to bring it in, to bring onshore.
Yeah, and I think it's thanks, Sarah. By industry as well, it's probably different. Working with our healthcare clients and looking at, the medical surgical supply chain and pharmaceutical supply chain. You've heard just in the last few weeks, several pharmaceutical companies who are investing in either expanding their existing manufacturing footprint or investing in building new manufacturing in the United States. So on the pharmaceutical side, I think the big disconnect is really between the generic drugs and the brand name drugs. So there's been a lot of discussion on, right now there are not tariffs on pharmaceuticals, but a discussion on, those might be coming. So in some industries there is a manufacturing footprint, but I think also in med surg and med device, it's just a matter, as Sarah mentioned, can you expand that and at what cost? And certainly everybody's going to take in consideration, smart factories. We have a smart factory that works in this area just to really optimize technology and efficiency. So you can reduce those costs, but there's a lot of considerations. And I think, the statistic, if you're, talking about data, I think they said 2 stand-up new manufacturing is probably a 2 to 3 year game at minimum, depending on the industry. And then, certainly in pharmaceuticals, there's some concern about if you do expand manufacturing, or you're bringing manufacturing here, the ability to have these products inspected and renewed and reviewed, and having the agency able to do that. So there's sort of a whole chain of sort of tasks that happen along the lines just with the increased manufacturing here. I'd love to hear, though, about retail and what that looks
Yeah. Thanks, Melinda. I appreciate that. I mean, I kind of like Sarah said, I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. But where I typically start is, going back to the due diligence that companies are doing. I mean, even if we believe that there is, the labor and the capability within the US, if you think about the tariffs that are imposed today, I think Sarah mentioned this earlier, 25% on steel and aluminum. So the cost, if they even wanted to build a domestic site at this point, have skyrocketed. And so that's a part of the challenge. And so what we're seeing is a lot of CEOs are doing, really a lot of due diligence on the investments, on what they should be making for the future, and in domestic sites. And they're talking to one another, right? And they've done analysis to say, okay, well, if the threshold, for example, of tariffs from Mexico goes over 35%, then we really need to go to another plan and really invest in domestic plants. And so I think they're trying to do that risk analysis right now of like what is that threshold? When do they need to, look into building in the US, and what does that look like? What's the timing? And also, Melinda made a clear point about this being like 2 to 3 year journey to stand up some of these plants. Well, in 4 years, there may be a new administration that, removes these tariffs, and it could be a whole different dynamic. So I think it's all about like the calculated risk that the retail industry is willing to take to shift a lot of this into the US.
Yeah, thanks. It really is industry by industry specific, just because they're in such different places and different regulations that are coming at them. So it's just so fascinating.
And Michelle, I think there was a question in the chat about, do we have I think you asked, are Americans willing, do we have the skill set? Yes. And, to Sarah's point, absolutely. I think there is a statistic now that there are already open manufacturing spots here in the United States. Like, I think the projection is by 2030, there'll be 400,000 open manufacturing spots to be filled currently right now. So, that's also a big consideration, is of course the skill set is there. How are those jobs, what's the training required? What's the motivation and the incentive, just like you said, to fill those jobs, because there are already existing manufacturing spots open. So what does that look like as we expand the manufacturing footprint here?
Are you?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just gonna say, to your point about how every industry.
It's such a good topic, right? We all want to jump in.
Anjali, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, I just like a small point here. To your point, Michelle, about how every industry is very different. It also depends on the industry in terms of the skill sets that are needed. So, in the automotive industry, a very specific skill set is needed. The tooling is very different than tooling needed for electronics, and that's where it gets into the difference of engineering requirements. I mean, I think that's part of the reason China is so good at making these like really high tech products, is because they have the engineering and tooling capability there. So I think it really is specific to the industry and the type of manufacturing sites that they would be building, and whether that labor and skill set is available here.
I agree. I also think that manufacturing jobs in the United States don't necessarily pay what other jobs in the United States pay. So if you're going to make more money in a retail job than you would make in a manufacturing job, then the manufacturers have to consider a higher wage. But the minute they consider a higher wage, then prices go up, and it's a domino effect. And so those are all the components that everyone's considering, right? So to Melinda's point about the 400,000 available manufacturing jobs, if those jobs on average pay $10 to $15 an hour, and someone can make more than that in a different environment that maybe to them feels better, whatever that means for them, they're less likely to take that manufacturing job, which means then you have a domino effect of labor cost. And the other thing, though, I think one piece that hasn't really been talked about is that if companies do decide to build, then that will lead to a construction job boom. And construction jobs are jobs that the younger generations, the Gen A's and the Gen Z's are taking today, right? They're interested in that. And there's actually a lot of people that are in the labor market for the trade jobs. And so I do think that there is that secondary benefit, right? The actual construction boom that comes along with building will potentially lead to an economic boost also, which isn't something that I think is talked about quite as much because everyone's still talking about, well, will it even happen? But then to Anjali's point, timber, steel, and aluminum, those have really high tariffs right now. So, you know, when are you going to recoup your investment? Your ROI is now 20 years instead of 10.
And, we've been struggling, at least I know when I was running a third-party logistics company, just trying to find the workforce to go and work in the warehouses and go work on the manufacturing floors. And a couple of the questions that we've seen in the chat are around this. What strategies have you seen that have been more successful, or you were like, wow, that's a really great way that they're approaching it, and it seems to be bringing people into those roles that you don't necessarily think that they would want to be in? Have you
I can speak a little to some of the great workforce strategies that I've seen with some of our life sciences clients when they're actually really starting early in high school. So if it's for a manufacturing job, they start with internships and, specific internships if they have a factory or a facility. See this as well in cell and gene therapy, where they're like really starting in high school to do this job force development and creating a connection to the company and, bringing them into the facility. Some of these cell and gene therapy products are really very specific manufacturing, sort of one product, one patient, one lot. So a lot of sort of upfront awareness, upfront education, and then tying into the communities that they're in and those schools, whether they're technical schools or technical high schools, and then sort of building that pipeline of talent with, very specific promotion milestones, and so that you can just, bring someone down on the path of like growth and opportunity and security. So I have seen several examples there for, very specific manufacturing jobs where a lot of our clients are just starting early with, growing talent in particular communities where they'll need them. And it's been very successful.
That's great. That's great to hear.
Yeah, and similar to what Melinda mentioned, I've seen where it's worked really well in the retail space. It's a lot of distribution centers. And so what I've seen work well in terms of DCs and warehouses is building programs where it's rotational so that people can start in one DC, maybe they're working on the floor, but then they get to move to another DC and they get to move up in their roles and be able to kind of differentiate and get experience and really grow within the organization. I think the theme between both what I'm saying and Melinda said is building a place where people see they can grow and there is a path forward in their career development and that the organization cares about that for them. I think that's how you're going to pull people in because they feel a sense of like, hey, if I do this, I can really see a future and I can grow and take care of my family or do whatever they need to. But I think those kinds of things have really pulled in talent.
It's great to hear. I'm seeing one of the questions that I think, Sarah, it's probably going to be directed to you where you were talking about the trickle-down effect. So this individual is asking about, what you're seeing from a long-term impact of the trickle-down on things like warehousing and real estate costs and things like that. You were talking more, I know, about like the synergies around building and, if we bring more manufacturing, that helps construction. So it's maybe not quite the same thing, but I am curious to hear what your thoughts are around
I didn't read the question. So is it specific to like the trickle down from, say, like more of like the trickle, like the bottoms up effect that says like the fiber that you used to buy in China, now you have to grow in America, that makes it all the way to the carpet in the car?
Talking
Or
about
is that the question? I'm sorry, I apologize.
Yeah,
I don't quite understand it because I didn't read.
No, it's okay. I think it's really more about what's the long-term effect of that this is all going to have as it comes down to warehousing and real estate costs and things like that.
Oh, it's a really hard question because from a scenario perspective, we don't really know. Like if we build a brand new warehouse today and that warehouse costs 25% more to build than it would have cost 5 years ago or even last week, those costs all have to go somewhere. And essentially it will end up in the consumer, right? Unless there's a way that a shareholder is going to say, I'm still going to invest and take a lower, I'm going to take a lower investment, right? Like I'm willing for that to happen. Though I do think that essentially, like every time you raise prices, it trickles down towards the consumer. I think that's pretty common knowledge in economics, right? And that's true for everything that you invest in. Maybe with the exception, I mean, not the exception, but like in utilities, I was saying earlier, the public utility commissions for each state, they set the rate that you pay for the wattage for the electricity that you use. And every time an energy company wants to increase their rates so that they can improve something, right? They have to improve the grid. They have to maintain, or if you live in California, the cost of the wildfires. That all eventually makes it to the consumer, but in utilities, it's regulated. So the government, that government entity, the Public Utilities Commission, right? They lock down and they say, no, you can't raise rates above X. You're stuck here. And what that does from a trickle down effect is it eventually pushes it down and it says, okay, well, if we can't raise rates, then we can't invest in. And that could be any number of investments into, you could name it anything that the company would invest in. Maybe they have to wait to replace the line. Maybe they have to wait for the undergrounding. Maybe they can't clear as many trees, right? But in the end, they're always going to focus on safety. So really what it comes down to is we can't build the substation we were planning to build next year because the cost is going to it's going to be 40% more expensive to build that substation, which means we can't support the data center down the street that, that Amazon wanted to build. So now they have to wait to build that data center and so on and so forth, right? So that it's really interesting by industry, the different type of trickle down effect that you will have based on increasing costs within the supply chain and the capital investments.
It absolutely is. So, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say there's some great questions in the chat. Happy to add on there, Sarah, though, that trickle down effect, but even that idea of, certainly if you're building here in the United States, like there's going to be a cost regardless of, any tariffs that are implied on, any particular material, but there's always a cost to build. But looking at it sort of differently, even in some areas where there are tariffs, it's very likely, you said to that point where labor might be 3 to 5 times more expensive here, that item or that thing may still be cheaper with the tariff added than it would be to either build it or buy it here or, manufacture it here in the United States. So I think there's a lot of those considerations going on. And I think, so Anjali, you mentioned that, there's a lot of consideration. And it's okay, Michelle, Maggie had a question just about healthcare specifically. Great question, Maggie. That's a great question in healthcare. And we're talking to healthcare leaders, supply chain leaders every day, because you have to constantly balance the need, it's patient care. At the end of the day, it's patient care. You have to deliver it. You have to deliver quality, safe patient care, and you need things to be able to do that. And everyone's supply chain, it's delicate at the best of times, right? So you are reliant on others in multiple places for multiple different things to put it all together of what you're delivering. So healthcare supply chain has not had an easy time. Coming out of COVID, but since then, natural disasters, port strikes, you name it, there's been so many issues in regards to, just the large quantity of medical supplies that are coming into the United States from outside the United States. So specifically around tariffs, a lot of it is just, working with our sourcing folks to understand, if price increases are coming, what are strategies to mitigate that? Is there pushback? It's understanding where your supply chain is coming from so that you can be, it's a lot of planning, a lot of conversation, but really it's a lot of strategizing. I think it's been said here, nobody exactly knows where tariffs might hit or where you might see the impact. So a lot of it is being prepared for potential or even opportunistic price increases and pushing back on that conversation. So Maggie, to that point, we work with leaders, helping them really deeply understand where the supply chain is and the exposure so that they can not have to impact patient care. But certainly there's some areas of the healthcare supply chain that are far more vulnerable than others. Sarah mentioned, raw earth minerals, like there's a whole part of the energy sector that is very reliant on something that is potentially could be in short supply. So it's sort of understanding those vulnerability areas and where those risks might be, and then how you manage, mitigate, conserve, look to other items, look at clinical practice and go from there. But it's an ongoing conversation. But yeah, your healthcare leaders are talking about it every day. Great question.
So one of the things that I love about these panel conversations is when we can give people advice or actionable strategies that they can think about and take back to their organizations. So I'd love to hear each of your perspectives of what are the strategies that you're seeing organizations use to mitigate the risk and the cost that's associated with these rising tariffs. And, what about specifically for maybe not those Fortune 200s, but the smaller organizations in particular? Is there a competitive advantage to be found in the situation for them? Sarah, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so I have so many thoughts. I know that everyone who knows me is shocked. So I think that the first thing for companies of all sizes, every single client I've spoken to has said, we've already looked at our materials. We've already tried to map our network. We already have a good idea of what percentage of our materials are going to be hit by tariffs. It's like baseline, right? Where people are struggling is what we call the end tier. So most people can tell you exactly where they're buying their first level, the first level from. Not everyone can tell you where their tier 3 or tier 4 all the way to tier N vendors are. And that's where that roll up cost comes from, because everything that gains a tariff as it moves around the globe and every time it comes in the US and then goes back out and then comes back in again, you're gaining more and more tariff, right? And so what we're seeing more and more is what I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the concept of scenario planning with Gen AI and digital twins. And I know that for a smaller company that might feel out of reach, but I don't think that it is. I think that there are a lot of companies out there that are building software to help you do digital twin and scenario modeling, because that's really what it comes down to, right? What did the tariffs do today? Can the news tell me what's happening? And can I apply it to the knowledge that I have in my network? In this digital twin network map example. I think Anjali mentioned earlier the network mapping. So that's kind of the basic, the table stakes is, where do my materials come from and what am I paying? I'm trying to negotiate with my vendors. I'm trying to renegotiate contracts, but everyone's feeling the same pain, right? So you go to your vendor and you say, hey, I need a break on this because of the tariffs. And they say, I can't give it to you because I already tried to talk to my vendor who tried to talk to their vendor down 6 lines down the chain, and maybe you get a couple points off the top, right? So that's a big one. But I think one of the things that many companies have also done is, in the US in Jan, Feb, and March, our imports increased 20% above the same time last year. So a lot of companies front loaded their inventory to try to get ahead of the April 12th date, right? Those that didn't do it are now hedging. Do I buy?
Right.
Because I don't know, right now we're in this 90-day pause on some tariffs. So I know I can get things across the ocean in 6 weeks. Is it worth it? I don't know. And so that's where the scenario planning comes in, I think. And then I have a couple ideas on a couple other things, but if you let me keep going, then I will probably mention.
Go ahead.
I'll just keep talking.
Out and then we'll go to Angie.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll go since there's a break. So I think Sarah mentioned a lot of great things. I think in the retail space, I think one of the immediate things that companies, if they haven't done already, is doing an analysis on price elasticity and really analyzing what are the products that they can adjust price for and they can still be purchased by the consumer. So that's one thing where they can increase prices right away. The second thing I've seen a lot of is accelerating productivity. And so if there's initiatives that companies have started around increasing productivity, they are doubling down on moving those forward. They're also doubling down on cost reduction initiatives. So things that they can do within their organization to impact cost and accelerate productivity are where there's a lot of activity within a lot of the retailers. And I think there was a question that was kind of related to this about what we're doing within the network, what people are doing within the networks. I think this is really where they're focusing on before they can make some big decisions on what else to do and that would impact capital. But that's really what they're trying to do and make sure that they can retain a level of service that is still manageable.
So building off a little bit about that, one of the questions was, what are you looking for, wishing that the transportation providers or third-party logistics providers are doing to help the
Mhm.
organizations to navigate this?
So I think two of the things I just mentioned, the other thing that they're looking at, I mean, quite honestly, is if they were building new facilities, they may be even slowing that down, right? Because they're not sure where they need these DCs to be. They're not sure what the consumer is going to be doing. And so a lot of these capital investments that they've already budgeted for, they are pausing or slowing down so that they can make better decisions when they have a little bit more certainty of what is going to happen with the tariffs and what they're going to really have in terms of a budget.
I can add in some other strategies as well. Again, maybe with a little bit of a healthcare lens. I will say the med device, med surge, there was a little bit of a, let's say, a preview of tariffs that were implemented last year under the previous administration around particular supply categories like needles and syringes and face masks. And part of that was an effort to, bring that manufacturing back to the United States, but also about quality. And you mentioned, Michelle, some of the smaller players. So we know that there are manufacturers in some of those areas who've been looking to move away from China in anticipation of the tariffs that were already going to be implemented, starting last year. And so being very resourceful and looking to find FDA approved manufacturers in other places that would be able to start production. So I think there probably is a lot of scouting going on of where else things can be manufactured, particularly if it's an FDA approved product. I think you are, and you mentioned as well, brand loyalty, or, what largely we have not seen a lot of, price increases coming, whether that's from GPOs or from the suppliers directly. There's a lot of just trying to understand where the impact will be. But I think you will see an opportunity for competition, or you will see an opportunity for suppliers who are going to absorb the expense for this first, maybe for the first year, and then be able to say that to their customers, saying, I'm not going to pass this on to you because you matter to me, you're an important client, you're an important customer. So I think some are willing to just take the hit and then see what happens down the road. And others, one strategy though it's the communication and the negotiation, and it is understanding the contract language. That being said, everybody has an out on their contracts for the most part in these unprecedented times. So, but being able to understand that not everything everywhere is at risk to these exceptional tariffs, but that you have some negotiating ability as well. So I think it's, it's a conversation that you have with your suppliers and with your customers, with your clients, things like that, because they're trying to figure it out as well. And I think most don't want to just pass it on. But as well, with some of the smaller players here, it might be that might be the end of it. I think there's a lot of concern around generic drugs, very, very small margins, largely manufactured outside of the United States. So there's been some conversation that, there are some manufacturers who might just stop producing if it's just too expensive, because there's such razor thin margins already in generics. So, and then some of that won't be able to, come back to the United States. Same thing, right? So not a lot of margin on some of these products, especially generic drugs. So concerns there, but a lot of it is still just, really ultimately trying to see where that impact will be felt.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it is a good opportunity for companies if they can afford to absorb the cost short term. Now, who knows what the definition of short term is, but to not pass it on to the consumer, it really can help from a brand loyalty perspective and boost that brand equity with the consumer. So that would be an interesting play to see how companies play that out. There is a question here that we've kind of touched on it a little bit. It was around kind of network modeling and things like that, and companies are taking a pause. But the question that kind of is extending beyond that. So like, how long do you foresee people being able to pause? And then once they come off a pause, what do you anticipate is going to happen once they feel forward to kind of move things forward again? So first of all, how long do you recognize people willing to or able to pause in their networking improvements?
I mean, I think that, we mentioned this they're pausing because they're waiting to see, but even there's changes coming out today that, or language saying the Chinese tariffs will not be as significant as they are right now. So I think the pause is because people really are just trying to see where this lands, and where it will be. If you had shipments coming in right now, obviously there's tons of stories that you're hearing of, suppliers being hit with, $12 million bill or more. So not everybody is immune, but the pause is probably because things have been changing so quickly and so often.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's really about a company's ability to take on the risk, right? So because there is so much uncertainty right now, it's depending on how risky they feel moving forward is. And they're not going to move forward until they feel like they are making a decision that they are confident in. And it's just unknown right now when they're going to feel that way, right? With things changing constantly, it's unclear when companies will feel confident enough to move forward with some of these, big investments. That's, I think, the kind of the most fascinating part of all of this is like, it's really not clear, like when things are going to slow down, when there's going to be some clear decisions, and when, people are going to feel confident to really act on a lot of these things that are happening, because it's just so uncertain. And no one wants to be the person that doubles down on a path forward and then, a month or two later, it's like completely changed and they've made the investment, right? So no one wants to be in that position, which is why they're slowing down.
I
I
agree.
think that I know we mentioned this earlier, and Melinda said, is this COVID 2.0? And I think for supply chains, in many ways, some of the strategies are similar. So in the last 5 years, we've seen such a significant increase in resiliency in supply chains globally, right? Everyone thought, oh, well, we have to build resiliency because we don't know what might come next. Well, this is the thing that came next that some companies prepared for the last 5 years, right? They thought, how do I build a resilient supply chain? How do I build flexibility? Where do I want to put my supply chain? And maybe they nearshored and now they're like, should have onshored. They don't know, and maybe that was maybe they should, but at the same time, if they nearshored to Mexico versus nearshoring, or maybe they nearshored to somewhere in the Caribbean, right? Those places may or may not have different tariffs. It's still, as I was mentioning earlier about like the benefits of onshoring, it still builds flexibility in your supply chain. It still builds like a shorter lead times and increased productivity and so on and so forth. So although I can't answer the question of how long should they wait, because unfortunately my crystal ball, as always, is a little foggy. I do think that building in resiliency and following like some of the same game plans from COVID on how to build that resiliency, which had a lot to do with scenario planning, and it had a lot to do with, how are we going to protect ourselves in the future? A lot of those strategies still stand strong. And so it's worth dusting those things off from 2021, 22 and saying, are these plans we created that we chose to go against, are they still valid? I'm going to apply new numbers to them, and I'm going to rethink, are these strategies something that we should be considering today? So I think we don't know. I think the answer is building resiliency, and that's hard to do because it requires investment.
I think there's also companies who, like to Sarah's point, are not just waiting. I think they're also trying to influence policy, right? Like they're advocating for, the targeted tariffs. They're looking for exemptions, for favorable trade policies. And so I think in the interim, they're really trying to influence and shape what the tariff should look like.
I
Yeah,
agree.
that's a great point. And you know what? I mean, companies have to think about that so differently than they ever had before. That's an excellent point.
And I think one of the other things that we haven't talked about yet is, in general, pretty much every company I've ever worked for, even previous to like, I've worked in, for those of you, I've worked in a bunch of different industries, and everyone is always talking about their inventory position and their E&O and their scrap and so on and so forth. And if you really think about it, all of that product is in some ways useful if it's a component. And so one of the things that some of my clients are doing is they're revisiting the concept of design to procure and design for supply chain. So what do you have in your inventory that's a component that you don't have to build a new thing for? So like in utilities, like, can I use a different hinge? than the one, will this hinge fit? Is it going to be the form, fit, function, and safety that I need to solve this problem or to build this substation or to, you know, whatever it is they're building or they're maintaining? Is the thing that I already have, will it work, right? So engineers and product designers are starting to think about, well, what can we repurpose that's already been approved from a design perspective that we may or may not have on hand? And so is that a long-term Band-Aid? No. But is it something that can help you in the short term? Absolutely. And then it has all the wonderful benefits of like reducing your SKU proliferation over time, right? So you don't end up with excess inventory in the future because now you use 10 component parts in 30 products instead of using 100 component parts in 30 products, right? So I think that's something to consider also as a resiliency option.
Yeah,
Then I
it's a
al-
good time to
okay.
streamline your operations and really look at how you can eliminate waste and drive more efficiency that way.
Mhm. And the last thing I think is that I think that Anjali kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, and I know Melinda talked about brand. What is it from a product mix and product segmentation and market segmentation perspective that we can adapt, right? And so how can we launch new products in a different way? Can we launch a product in a different market that we already have? Or in which ways, what can we do with our mix, right? And then how can we add value in a way that doesn't have like a material cost, like a physical material cost to our business, right? So if I already have an app, can I drive more brand loyalty and can I drive more business by offering access to certain features of that app for free, right? Because that is something that I'm maintaining, but it's not a physical product. It won't pick up a tariff. So how can we kind of work with our clients to increase that brand loyalty and additional types of product value?
That's a great point. Melinda, I think I cut you off.
No, not at all. I was just going to say, I mean, to Sarah's point, it's just being resourceful, right? So in challenging times, it requires everyone to think differently about how they do what they do on a regular basis and look at different options. And so maybe sometimes that does spark, innovation, right? Can you do more with less? Do you need, all these SKUs or not all of them? So sometimes it does, make us all think a little bit differently on the day to day, and just the the vulnerabilities. It will force us all to be really resourceful, to be more resilient. So I think in the idea of building resiliency into your supply chain, a lot of it is about understanding and knowing where are the risks, where are the vulnerabilities, where's the exposure. So maybe a good exercise in many ways for all of us to really be even more prepared. Sarah mentioned, everyone is more prepared now because the last big thing was not that long ago. So already approaching this differently than had, everything been smooth sailing prior to. So so some of that is good and some of this will be positive, but everyone managed, COVID was challenging, but they did build resiliency in supply chains is common term that everyone's using all the time now because they must be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. So I like to end things like on a positive note. So really quickly, I would love to hear from each of you kind of what's your best piece of advice that you want to give to our supply chain leaders that are on this call who are really stepping up and leading us through yet another significant challenge in our industry? And Anjali, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. I mean, I think this is a great opportunity, right? If you're a supply chain, there was so much opportunity that came out of COVID, and I think there's a lot of opportunity that could come out of this as well. I mean, it is really an opportunity, like Sarah and Melinda just mentioned, to be innovative, to think of big ideas, things that may not have been, on the table in the past, may be reevaluated now, especially when it comes to managing cost and productivity that is really needed right now. I've seen a lot of companies, ideas that we put on the table a year or 2 years ago, they're now saying, yeah, let's move forward. So I think that there is an opportunity to think big, think differently, and be innovative. And I think it's a time where those ideas are going to be met and thought about really as something to move forward with. So it's exciting in that aspect.
I think that's a great point, how just because something you tried it maybe or broached it a year or two ago, it's time to dust that off and try it again because things are different. And the level of tolerance for trying new things, I think, is in a very different place than it
Yes,
past. And I think that is
completely agree.
really key.
Mhm.
So thank you for that.
Mhm.
Melinda, do you have anything more to add? I know you
Yeah, I
kind
was just gonna say, just be prepared. I mean, and it's like those things that, understanding your contract language and just understand as much as you can. Stay current on, what the latest is and just be prepared for a discussion, right? So it's not a one-way street. It's an opportunity for you to even deepen relationships that you have with your suppliers and have that conversation. So I think that's the best piece of advice is just, it can be a two-way street because you will have other suppliers who will be looking to, if you're looking to move, they're going to be there for you and they're not going to pass costs on. So just be prepared, understand your language, and be prepared for a conversation because it's an opportunity to really deepen relationships.
Yeah, that's so true. We're all in this together, so it
Mhm.
really is a great
True.
opportunity. And Sarah, how about you?
I think it's stay calm, right? Like everyone's panicking, but we're okay. It's going to be okay, right? Like stay calm, use data, run scenarios, adapt your strategy, build resilience, right? Like those are kind of like the core things. I really strongly feel that, 5 years ago, we navigated this global pandemic that nobody saw coming. And we can do that again. We can navigate through a new scary thing, a new unknown thing. And to Anjali's point, we're going to come out the other end stronger, right? A lot of good things came out and that will happen this time too. We just have to, one foot in front of the other, right? We can do it. That's
Through it,
my opinion. Stay calm. You got it.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your insights and giving us some best practices and lessons learned. And just you guys had given so much rich information in this conversation. So really appreciate everything that you did and shared with us today. And I want to thank everybody who's on the call for participating and joining us. And I hope that you got a lot out of the conversation and hope to see you at another awesome event very soon. Thanks, everyone.